My name is Julie Garcia, and I am one of the co-chairs for the Diversity and Climate Committee, and I'll introduce the whole committee in a moment. But first, I just want to thank you for coming today to hear our share out of the Diversity and Climate Survey and the Sexual Harassment Survey. So I want to alert you to a few things. One is we do have, Evelyn Carter will be monitoring Twitter to look at your responses. So if you have some questions as they come up, please use the hashtag SPSP Town Hall 2019 to offer your questions there. And you can also ask them in person as well. So let me just tell you a little bit about our process. In 2016, there was a task force that identified a need in our organization to do a climate survey. Then the board tasked the Diversity and Climate Committee with creating a survey and administering it. So as part of that process, I want to identify my fellow DCC members, Diana Sanchez, the co-chair, Daryl Wout, Evelyn Carter, Kristen Packer, also members of the DCC, and also our sexual harassment task force members. They'll introduce themselves in a moment. We had several consultants that also offered their feedback about how we assessed and asked particular items on the survey. And then we had stats help from Olivia Holmes and Allison Mueller. So let me provide you with an overview of our survey. So our overarching objective was to collect information about people's experiences and perceptions within our organization. And as a result of receiving that data, it was to inform policies and procedures in our organization as a whole. So the online survey was available for approximately 1 month. We had a total of nearly 1,100 people who responded to the survey, which reflects about 15% of our SPSP membership. I'll share with you demographics on the next slide. For all people who participated, we asked them to respond to a few different questions. One is to give SPSP an overall diversity grade, diversity and inclusion grade. We also asked them how well does SPSP meet the needs of various groups, people's experiences with bias, people's perceptions of representation in terms of awards, leadership, presenters, and presenters of SISP instructors. And then we also asked them how much they perceived being valued by SPSP as a whole. And then we did an analysis where we examined if those perceptions differed depending on the social identity group that was responding to it. So for example, did people in the US versus international respondents perceive differences in how much they perceive themselves being valued by SPSP? So next I want to share with you some demographics. I know this is a lot of data to take in, but we do have a 150-page report that's available online. So what we're going to do today is provide you with broad strokes of both the sample and our main findings. So what we have here is a sample demographics, and you can see on this top table are demographics that we typically collect from SPSP. Gender, sexual orientation, race, ethnicity, ability status, and career stage. And on the left side, you'll see the sample for our study. And on the right side, in parens, is the overall SPSP demographics. In addition to the typical demographics that we collect, we also collected some additional demographics, namely socioeconomic status, institution type, first generation status, nationality, parent status, and political ideology. I just want to note the majority of the sample was female, heterosexual, white or European. It didn't note that they had a disability, and were graduate students. For the most part, that mirrored our overall demographics with a few exceptions. Men and full professors were underrepresented in our sample. So as I said at the beginning, all groups gave an overall diversity grade for SPSP. People could give an A to an F, and that corresponded to a score of 1 to 13. So we can see this amazing graphic that, thank you, Evelyn, for creating. So on the whole, people gave, on average, an average diversity grade of a 4.47, which corresponds to about a B+. I also wanted to note the 3 groups that had significantly lower grades, gave lower grades, namely people of color, political conservatives, and people of lower SES status. And we see undergrads are loving their experience at SPSP. So, as I mentioned before, we noted experiences with bias. Women reported safety issues and discriminatory treatment compared to men. 12% mentioned sexual harassment experience at SPSP 2018, and my colleagues will dive deeper into those findings in a moment. Racial and ethnic minorities, 16.8% mentioned an incident of racial bias in SPSP 2018. We also found that many people noted instances of not feeling valued at the SPSP convention. People with disabilities reported feeling devalued, noted accessibility issues, and 2/3 said that SPSP failed to meet their needs. There was also a noted lack of gender diversity, particularly among the transgender community. First gen and lower socioeconomic status respondents tended to report feeling like outsiders and reported financial barriers to attending networking events and SPSP as a whole. International and sexual minority respondents noted lack of representation. People from predominantly teaching and non-academic positions reported bias towards prestigious universities and lack of career support. Parents reported stigma, lack of access to parent-friendly options, and 2/3 said SPSP failed to meet their needs. And lastly, political conservatives reported feeling less valued and welcomed at SPSP. Many groups noted a lack of professional development opportunities, networking, and things of the like. In particular, women, people with disabilities, first gen, lower socioeconomic status, racial and ethnic minorities, sexual minorities, and political conservatives tended to report that in the climate survey. In August, we presented these preliminary findings to the board, and as a result of that presentation, the board has taken a lot of actions. There's been some actions towards gender inclusion. As you can notice when you checked in, there's an opportunity to indicate your gender pronouns on your badge. If you haven't done so yet, please go ahead and pick up your gender pronouns. There's also gender-neutral bathrooms that have been identified in our app. There's been movement in terms of diversity issues and financial barriers, addressing those. We expanded the number of diversity travel awards from 50 to 60. And as you know, we lost a very influential and dedicated colleague, Janessa Shapiro, who is dedicated to diversity and inclusion. And in her honor, funds have been raised, and the board is in the process of developing a Shapiro Award in her honor that will be that's in the process of being developed. For international representation, this conference, there's an international reception that's being held, and a new international task force is being created. To foster inclusion for those from teaching institutions, a teaching slam is being developed. So it's similar to a research slam where people talk about their data quickly. People can share their teaching best practices in a quick style format. We're revising our Teacher Scholar Award criteria. So we did an analysis of how many applicants we had in the last 3 years, and we noted those application numbers were dwindling, and we wondered why. So as a consequence to that, people can reapply every 3 years, and you no longer have to be presenting to win that award. And also, the board will be voting on a member at large from primarily undergraduate institutions. To help address parent resources, this year we had family care grants that people could apply for. And to foster diversity among SPSP leadership, the board has invited a DCC member to be on the nominating committee. With that said, of course, there's more actions to be done. So the Diversity and Climate Committee recommends several things. For example, enhancing accessibility, improving accessibility for those with mobility issues, and increasing a commitment to accessible PowerPoints for those with visual and hearing impairments. Improving our communication by increasing awareness of our code of conduct to avoid disrespectful comments in presentations. We did a qualitative analysis of bias incidents, and we tended to find that people, when they noted incidents of bias, it tended to be in the form of presentations or a Q&A. So not dyadic interactions, but really in a broader format. So perhaps with strengthening that code of conduct, that those types of exchanges could be avoided. And we also recommend that the board increases transparency with decision-making, perhaps with making board notes available to our constituents. We can foster inclusion by increasing diversity in presenters, topics, and leadership. Professional development and networking opportunities can be increased. As was noted, lots of people noted a lack of professional development opportunities. We can foster inclusion among various groups. As noted with the diversity grade, there are some groups that noted not being, feeling valued. We can increase opportunities for those from teaching institutions. We can work on removing financial barriers, like exploring ways to make the conference more affordable, expand travel award opportunities, and revisit our housing policies. It was very clear in the survey that people did not like the way in which we have a block system for hotel reservations, so revisiting that process. And really we see this as a process. We see the Diversity and Climate Committee as your advocates for speaking to the board about diversity and inclusion initiatives, and in that vein, we're gonna have a Q&A session where most of our time is gonna be for that Q&A. So I'll be presenting, the Sexual Harassment Task Force will be presenting, and then we'll offer a lot of time for that Q&A portion. So we invite you, again, to use the hashtag SPSP Town Hall 2019 to offer any comments that you have. And with that, the Sexual Harassment Task Force Committee will go next.
Okay, my name is Sam Sommers. I'm co-chair of the Task Force on Sexual Harassment in Personality and Social Psychology, and I'm going to be turning things over in a moment to my fellow co-chair, Oz, who's going to run us through some of the data from our recent survey. So just to set the stage, and some of this will be information that's well, not redundant, but dovetails with what Julie suggested, because the survey that was sent out was a joint venture from the Diversity and Climate Committee and the Task Force on Sexual Harassment. In January 2018, SPSP approved a task force to study sexual harassment in personality and social psychology with an explicit focus on 3 objectives. Number 1, the empirical study of the prevalence of the problem and perceptions of SPSP responses to it. Number 2, assessment of SPSP policies related to sexual harassment, and discussion, review, consideration of best practices for prevention, for future prevention of harassment. Number 3, the evaluation of ways to solicit, support, and publicize additional research on sexual harassment and harassment prevention. Given the scope of what we as personality and social psychologists study in our research, we have the opportunity to be leaders on this issue for our own society, big S society certainly, but for the bigger little lowercase s society as well. And so how can we best marshal those resources and leverage that expertise along those lines? What Oz and I are going to be talking about here, again, very briefly, as Julie suggested, our hope is to share with you walk you through some of the major findings from this survey, which has already been made public, and then leave a lot of time for questions and discussion and so forth. But we're going to focus on number 1 here, the empirical study of the prevalence of the problem and perceptions of SPSP responses to it. So the Sexual Harassment Task Force, you'll see the composition, the 8 members to whom we're grateful for their time and efforts in this endeavor. Our statistical analyses, Allison Mueller, and additional assistance from Olivia Holmes. So big thanks to them for all their assistance with the huge amount of data that this survey brought forth. And so we are not going to spend much time on the instrument itself, other than to give you the following insight about it. It was created in conjunction with the Diversity and Climate Committee survey, so this actually went out as one instrument. If you completed this, which we hope you did the Diversity and Climate Committee questions, and then got to the questions more focused on sexual harassment. It was based largely on surveys that have already been developed and administered by the ARC3, as well as another survey, a similar survey at UC Berkeley. And the complete instrument is available on the SPSP website at this link, and you can Google SPSP Sexual Harassment Report, and you'll be able to find the instrument there. So I'm going to turn things over to Oz, who's going to walk us through some of the major findings from the survey.
Okay, so really quickly, the prevalence of sexual harassment incidents. So when we looked at the data, what we found was that 19% of the respondents reported having personally experienced some form of self-defined sexual harassment at least once in their career in SPSP contexts. And this prevalence was 9% for our last convention in Atlanta. So these numbers are for self-defined sexual harassment. But if we take a less conservative approach and look at respondents who reported that they had personally experienced at least one of potentially sexually harassing behaviors from a checklist, then the prevalence rates go up to 32 for all-time SPSP events and 14 for 2018 in Atlanta. So our next set of analysis looked at whether there were differences as a function of a series of demographic variables. And what we found, as you might expect, is that women reported having experienced sexual harassment more frequently than men, both at all SPSP events and in the Atlanta Convention. When you look at whether they witnessed or were told firsthand of such instances, then the gender differences are actually much smaller, not significant for Atlanta Convention, still significant for the all-time SPSP events, but a lot more closer, suggesting that men are witnessing these events, are aware of these events at comparable rates to women, even though they themselves are not the direct victims. We did not find any significant differences by respondent race. We found some differences based on respondent sexual orientation, mostly clustering for the Atlanta Convention, where respondents of sexual minorities reported a greater experience and witnessing of such events. When we looked at career stage as pre-post, many were not significant, except that post-PhD, more senior people seem to be witnessing or being told of such events to a greater extent than pre-PhD individuals. Probably, perhaps they're being perceived as resources. And of the people who answered questions about their most significant sexual harassment experience at SPSP, so people who said, yes, I experienced something, whereas think about the most significant one to date, and answer the following questions based on that incident. And 165 respondents answered these questions. So at the time of the harassment incident, predominantly they were graduate students, followed by faculty, postdocs, and undergraduates. And the participants reported that the perpetrators were mostly faculty members and other graduate students. The most common convention context for these experiences involved some kind of social setting, restaurant, bars, social event, break between workshops, and some poster sessions. And what was very interesting to us was the low reporting rates of the 165 people who responded to this, prompt about their most significant experience. Only 3 indicated that they had engaged in some kind of reporting, 2 to their to the home institution of the person, and 1 to SPSP. Most people said that they avoided the person, they made a joke out of it, they asked for advice, and some people did ask the perpetrator to stop. On how to move forward, I'm going to turn it to Sam.
Sure. So we also did solicit open-ended responses from the respondents, and one of those questions was a question about how you as members, how we as members felt that the society should best move forward to address issues of sexual harassment. 121 responses from the entire survey responded to this question about specific actions that they would like to see SPSP take. Here you see some of the more common responses. Stricter code of conduct with the consequences spelled out, 27 people articulated that comment. On the other side of the coin, though articulated less often, only 8, a less strict code of conduct that only focused on illegal behavior. 11 people, more education, symposia on sexual harassment, training on how to respond to sexual harassment and so forth. 6 people suggested clarification and expansion of reporting procedures. 5 individuals suggested that a reduction in emphasis on quote-unquote bar behavior and an alcohol focus to aspects of the conference would be advisable. And 4 people also noted the need for greater transparency surrounding sexual harassment incidents, how they were handled and how they proceeded and so forth. So the next steps from the standpoint of this task force. The task force co-chairs, Oz and I, will be meeting with the board of directors on Sunday to present our report to the board, to discuss our recommendations related to those multiple objectives that were outlined earlier. I will not give you every last one of the recommendations here being offered, though again, we'll give you some of the highlights here, some of which have already been implemented. Potential modifications to the code of conduct, which we can certainly discuss if people are interested in doing so, though again, that will be a topic for the board to discuss and eventually vote on. The recommendation that there be ombuds service available, and indeed that's already been implemented. So hopefully you've seen this. You've seen the signage here at the convention hall, notices in the app and the program, and an email that went out to everyone as well that suggests that if you would like to have a conversation about anything that you experience at this convention regarding sexual harassment, regarding discrimination or unfair treatment, that we hope that you will take advantage of this opportunity to have a conversation with an independent, anonymous, confidential ombud service that's being provided by the society this year, and in fact will be available in the several days after the convention ends as well for discussion if you have those kinds of concerns and would like to have some anonymous and confidential consultation from someone who is not affiliated with SPSP. There'll be recommendation for programming featuring research related to sexual harassment and harassment prevention. And of course, if you go through this year's program closely, you'll see that there are some talks like that already in the program, and there'll be discussion about how to continue to do that and to emphasize that aspect of what we as personality and social psychologists study. We'll be proposing the inclusion of some harassment-related assessment items in the post-convention survey. There's a survey that goes out to all of us who attend the convention every year, and while we think it's great that this instrument was sent out to our membership this year, in 2018, to capture people's perceptions and experiences, we know all too well as scientists that if we don't continue to assess this, we won't know how things are going. And so we think it's really important the task force does for there to be continued annual assessment of these issues as they play out as we move forward, so that we can continue to take the temperature of how we're doing on these issues and what our membership is experiencing when they come to our convention and participate in other SPSP events, as well as some discussion of alcohol-related norms at the annual convention. So these are among the next steps that the task force will be taking up with the board at the meeting on Sunday.